Again, I'm very happy to be able to join you for a few moments of Bible study today. Today, I want to ask one simple question. Why is it that it seems that so many members of the church cannot live at peace with one another? The world and the church are often torn apart by strife and conflict. We live in a world in which there are many wars and countries always fighting with one another. Organizations fighting one another. People are fighting with one another. And it spills over into the church as well. Now, of course, the Bible is filled with exhortations for God's people to live together in peace. Let's just notice just one of those verses for just a moment. In Mark chapter 9, in verse 50, Jesus says, "Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another." Notice the last phrase there. It says, have peace with one another. Jesus encourages us to be at peace with one another. And yet, it's not uncommon at all to hear about a team of Christians once working together in great harmony, but for long they're breaking up in conflict and strife. Most church leaders could tell about many cases of conflict with which they are familiar and the problems that it caused to the Lord's body. Why is it that Christians cannot live together in peace? Well, I'm sure there are many reasons for that, but I think one reason is that many people simply want to insist on their own rights. We live in a world in which most people says, this is my right. I have a right to do this. And if they have a right to do this, then they're insistent upon doing it. That seems to be their motto. If their actions bother you, well, that's your problem. It's not mine. If their actions cause you harm in some way or another, well, again, that's your problem because they have a right to do whatever they're doing. And so if it causes harm to you, well, that's just the way it is. If you get bothered by it, if it causes you harm, if it cause you to get upset or whatever, then again, they would simply say, well, you just have to get over it. You just have to learn to live with it because that's my right to do whatever it is that I'm doing. And of course, that attitude often carries over into the church as well. Christians continue to insist on their own rights. If someone mistreats me or talks about me, then I immediately want to strike back because I have a right to protect myself. I have a right to protect my reputation. Now, while this attitude sounds reasonable, it is not necessarily biblical because we have many exhortations to avoid grudging or vengeful attitudes. Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek and to go the second mile. We are encouraged to love our enemies and to do good to those who will spitefully use us in Matthew 5, verses 38 through 44. Paul enjoins us to repay no one evil for evil, Romans 12, verse 17, and not to avenge ourselves, but rather give vengeance to God, Romans 12 and verse 19. So these verses and many others we can mention point out the fact that just because I might have a right to do something, then I should not inflict my harm upon you. And even if I am harmed by someone, neither should I try to strike back or take vengeance on them, because I need to turn the other cheek. I need to love my enemies, love and pray for those that would despitefully use me, according to the words of Jesus. Give vengeance to God, let him take care of it, in other words. Now, this attitude we're talking about is not easy to have, and certainly it is not natural. No, it is natural for us to want to strike back and to get even, so to speak. It takes effort for one to achieve such control as what we're talking about. In the Old Testament, we find many examples of people who did that or did not do that, some good examples and some bad examples. We look at one good example in Genesis chapter 26. Here is a man by the name of Isaac, Abraham's son, and he chose to avoid conflict and suffer loss. rather than insist on his own rights. He was living with his herdsmen in very close proximity to Abimelech and the Philistines. Now, by this time, Isaac had already grown to be very prosperous. God was certainly blessing him, and the Philistines began to envy him for his blessings and his wealth. They asked Isaac to leave them, which he did. And he then moved to the city of Gerar, or the province of Gerar, where Abraham had originally dug new wells of running water. The Philistines immediately claimed that all of that water was theirs. But rather than insisting that he had a right to that water, because after all, it was his father Abraham who had originally dug that well, he simply moved on to another place. He dug new wells. And again, the Philistines came and claimed their water was theirs. And again, Isaac moved again and found new wells. And Philistines quarreled over them as well. But eventually Isaac moved and dug new wells and finally found a place where the Philistines did not quarrel with him. Now, he did not have to move all those times. That water was legitimately his. Either his father dug the wells or he dug the wells himself. Either way, that water was legitimately his water, and yet rather than have conflict, he chose the way of peace and moved on and dug new wells. Now, he suffered loss. A lot of work that he or his husband went to for nothing, all for the benefit of someone else. So certainly he suffered some temporary loss, but he chose to suffer temporary loss in order to have peace. All those wells had been dug by him or his father. Now, some might criticize Isaac's behavior as cowardly. Some would even call him a very weak man, because a strong man would insist upon his rights. A strong man would insist that that water is mine, and you're not going to take it from me. And yet the wise man wrote in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 8, there is a time of war and a time of peace. You see, this was a time of peace. And Isaac chose the peaceful way. Even though he suffered temporary loss and hardship, he continued to prosper because God blessed him. He continued to live peacefully in the land of Canaan. And this likely would not have been possible if he had not chosen the way of peace. It seems to me that he provides a good example for us even today. You see, we do not always have to press our rights. It is sometimes good to even suffer loss for the sake of peace and harmony. This should certainly be true in regards to the Lord's church. You know, just because something might be within my rights does not necessarily mean it's good for me to do it. Paul expressed that truth in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 23 and 24. There Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Notice what Paul there says. He says, all things are lawful, but not all things edify. No, not all things are good for me to do, because they're going to cause harm or spiritual harm to my fellow Christian. And Paul goes on to encourage, let each one seek the other's well-being. Don't always be insistent on what's good for you. Think about what's good for the other person. If it means suffer a temporary loss, then so be it, because it's good for the other person. Now, in this context, Paul was discussing the eating of meats offered to idols. Now, in that context, in that culture, we find that there were many idolatrous practices going on. Many pagans would offer meat to their idols, and then they would go turn around and sell some of that meat in the marketplace. And it was a great discussion among Christians whether they should eat of that meat or not, because after all, it had once been offered in worship to an idol. Even though they were not worshiping the idols or had nothing to do with it, Then some felt it was not right because that meat was originally offered in worship to an idol. Well, Paul was saying that eating of the meat or not eating of meat, really it doesn't matter, because no longer was it involved in worship to an idol. And even though it might have once been offered in worship to an idol, it had no association with that now. And so therefore, as Christians, we could either choose to eat of it or not to eat of it, depending on what your conscience tells you. But some were very weak, and some felt like it was deathly wrong for them to do that. And Paul said, if that's true, if you thought it was wrong, then you should not eat of that. And even if I did eat of it, and even though I knew it was not wrong, if it caused harm to you, then I should not eat of it either. You see, the overriding principle was not whether it was right or wrong, but whether is it good and edifying to others. Paul stated further in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 33, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they might be saved. You see, Paul again pointed out that the overriding principle is it good for you spiritually? If it's good for you spiritually, then I should do it. If it's bad for you spiritually, then of course I should not do it. Even though it might be within my own rights to do something, if it would cause spiritual harm to you, then I should not do it. You see, as Christians, our primary goal should not be to please myself. It should not be to simply do what I want to. Rather, we should seek to edify one another. And in Ephesians 4, verse 3, Paul said, endeavor to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We should strive to keep the unity in the church in peace. Even if it means suffering and temporary loss, then I should be willing to do it for the good of the church, for the good of the spiritual welfare of my fellow man. Oh, if we would all remember this principle, many of the conflicts that presently occur in the church would not exist any longer, and certainly they would be much easier to solve, wouldn't it? Are we really seeking the good of my fellow man? You see, that's the question we need to be asking ourselves. And that would answer the question we asked earlier, why cannot Christians live at peace with one another? We could live at peace with one another if we were more concerned with the other's welfare rather than my own rights. Where are you in regards to peace within the church? I'm sure we all think of people who seem like they cause a lot more troubles than they ever solve. They're always in the front of causing some type of conflict, it seems. While others, they're always very peaceful, always very loving, and they certainly would not cause any conflict at all. Well, we need to keep in mind that God is more pleased with those who are peace-loving. You remember Christ said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall see God. If we are going to see God, we must be peacemakers. We must be interested in the welfare of other people. Let us close by one verse in Romans chapter 15 and verse 2. It said, let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification. Notice we need to look for edification for other people. That should be our goal. Not doing whatever I can, not doing what is right for me to do necessarily, but doing what is good for the spiritual welfare of my fellow Christian. If we would all do that, then most of our problem we have in the church would just simply cease to exist. Thank you.